Harry didn't get a call, he didn't receive a report, and no one from the palace asked him to come. All he got was a photo. Prince Louis sitting alone at a Balmoral window, silent, still, with a faint bruise darkening one side of his face. No explanation, no context, just 5 words from a royal guard: "You should be here." And within hours, Harry was walking through Balmoral's stone corridors at night, past staff who wouldn't meet his eyes, past security zones that had already been cleared long before anyone admitted something had happened. Because this wasn't about a bruise. It was about why an entire wing of the palace had been emptied before anyone called his father. Before we show you what the guard placed in Harry's hands on that staircase, and what changed inside Balmoral before sunrise, take a second to subscribe, chat, and turn on the bell. Because in this story, no one raised their voice, but the silence that followed carried more power than any confrontation ever could. Late afternoon light lay quietly across the desk, diffused through tall windows that overlooked a line of winter bare trees. The room was orderly in the way of someone who had long learned to manage both public life and private space. Nothing extravagant, nothing cluttered. Just a few framed photographs, neatly stacked briefing folders, and a silver pen resting parallel to the edge of a leather blotter. Prince Harry had been reading through correspondence without urgency. It was routine work, charitable schedules, logistics notes, minor administrative approvals, the kind of tasks that filled the quieter hours of a day when nothing demanded immediate attention. The notification tone that broke the silence was soft, almost polite. He glanced at the screen expecting another routine message. Instead, he saw an encrypted sender identifier he recognized instantly, not from frequent contact but from the type of clearance attached to it. A Royal Guard channel. Harry opened it without hesitation. There was no text, only a photograph. For a moment, he simply looked at it without reacting, his mind absorbing the image before allowing any interpretation. Prince Louis sat beside a tall window framed in heavy stone. The light behind him was pale and northern, unmistakably Balmoral. His posture was still, not tense, but withdrawn, the way children sometimes sat when they were trying to make themselves smaller without realizing it. His gaze was turned slightly away from the camera, affixed somewhere outside the frame, and along one cheek, faint but unmistakable in the shadow of the light, there was a soft discoloration, a bruise that had not yet darkened fully, just beginning to bloom beneath the skin. Harry's expression didn't change dramatically. He didn't lean forward, didn't exhale sharply, but his eyes remained on the image longer than they would have for anything ordinary. He zoomed in once, not on the bruise itself, but on the surrounding details, the angle of the window, the absence of anyone else in the reflection, the quiet emptiness of the room around the boy. Only after he studied those details did he notice the single line beneath the image. No greeting, no explanation, just 5 words. "You should be here." Harry read the message twice. Then he set the phone down on the desk, very carefully. As though the act itself required precision. The room remained silent, but the quiet now felt different, heavier, more deliberate, as if something unseen had shifted just enough to be noticed, even without a sound. Harry did not reach for the phone again immediately. He remained seated, hands resting loosely on the desk, eyes fixed not on the message now, but on the reflection of the window across the polished wood surface. It was a habit formed over years, allowing a moment to pass before reacting, giving instinct time to settle into clarity. Only after that stillness did he pick the device back up. He enlarged the photograph once more, this time studying it with a quieter, more methodical attention. The bruise was faint, too faint to provoke panic on its own. It could have been the result of anything ordinary, a collision during play, a misjudged step, the sort of minor injury children accumulated without ceremony. But it wasn't the bruise that held his focus, it was everything around it. Louis was alone. There was no blurred figure reflected in the glass behind him, no movement in the corridor beyond the doorway, no signs of activity in what should have been a frequently used wing of the estate. The room looked cleared. Harry lowered the phone slightly and considered that thought without allowing it to form into accusation. He tapped William's number first. The call did not connect. It ended after a brief pause with a neutral automated tone, neither declined nor answered. He tried again. The same result. A third attempt went to the estate switchboard, where a calm voice informed him that His Royal Highness was currently unavailable and would return calls shortly. The phrasing was polite, routine, and completely unlike how such calls were usually handled between them. Harry ended the call without comment. He did not attempt to contact any other staff. He did not reply to the guard's message. Instead, he placed the phone face down and stood. The decision came without visible deliberation. There was no sudden urgency in his movements, no signs of agitation. He simply crossed the room with the same measured pace he used for everything else. A coat was taken from the rack near the door, keys lifted from a shallow dish. A brief glance at the photograph on the desk, one of Lewis laughing during a summer garden event, cheeks flushed with sunlight. Harry's hand paused there for a moment, resting lightly against the frame. Then he stepped away. There was no announcement made, no explanation given. Within minutes he was already on his way north, moving not with alarm but with the quiet, unmistakable purpose of someone who understood that something had shifted, and that waiting for clarification was no longer an option. By the time Harry reached Balmoral, the last of the daylight had already slipped behind the hills, leaving the estate wrapped in that particular northern dusk that never fully darkened the sky. The air carried a faint chill, sharp and clean, the kind that settled quietly into the stone walls and lingered long after sunset. His arrival was not announced beyond the minimum required security clearance. The outer gates opened with the same mechanical efficiency they always had, but there was a subtle difference in the rhythm of movement around them. Fewer staff crossing the courtyard, where fewer lights burning in the windows of the administrative wing. It wasn't emptiness, it was control. Harry noticed it immediately. He stepped from the vehicle without pausing, his posture relaxed but purposeful, and crossed the gravel with steady strides that echoed softly in the quiet. No one rushed forward to greet him. No aides approached with explanations. Instead, the few staff members visible along the corridor entrances did something else. They stepped aside. Not dramatically, not even noticeably to an untrained eye. Just a slight shift of posture, a widening of space as he passed. Their expressions remained composed, but their silence carried weight. Inside, the long stone corridors of Balmoral stretched ahead, lit by warm, recessed lighting that softened the edges of the centuries-old walls. As the familiar scent of polished wood and aged stone lingered in the air, grounding the space in its usual stillness. Yet, something about that stillness felt deliberate. Harry walked forward without hesitation, his eyes moving instinctively over details others might not have noticed. A service door that normally remained open was closed and locked. A side passage leading toward the guest wing was temporarily cordoned off with a discreet brass barrier. 2 security personnel stood farther down the hall than protocol typically required, positioned not to block movement, but to redirect it. He didn't ask questions, didn't slow his pace, but each observation settled quietly into his understanding, forming a pattern that was unmistakable once seen. This wasn't the aftermath of an incident. This was the containment of one. As he reached the base of the main staircase, the ambient quiet seemed to deepen slightly, as though the building itself held its breath. Harry lifted his gaze toward the upper landing and saw a familiar figure waiting there, perfectly still in the half-light. The royal guard had positioned himself not at the top of the stairs, and not at the bottom, but precisely between them, as though marking the point where routine ended and something else began. The guard did not move as Harry approached. He stood with the same composed stillness expected of his post, hands behind his back, shoulders square, gaze level. The deep red of his tunic caught the warm light from the corridor sconces, the polished brass buttons reflecting faint, steady glints as Harry climbed the first steps. There was no salute, no formal announcement. At only a slight incline of the head as Harry reached the midpoint of the staircase. It was not disrespect, it was recognition. Harry stopped one step below him, close enough that neither needed to raise their voice. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet between them carried the weight of an understanding already shared before a single word had been exchanged. Harry's eyes flicked once toward the upper floor behind the guard. "Is he awake?" he asked, his voice low, steady. "Resting," the guard replied. "Doctor attended earlier. No further concerns at present." The phrasing was precise, reassuring without elaboration. Harry nodded once. His gaze returned to the guard's face, searching not for emotion, because there was none, but for something else, intention. It was there, subtle but unmistakable. Without shifting his posture, the guard brought one hand forward and produced a sealed envelope from beneath his arm. The motion was controlled, deliberate, neither hurried nor ceremonious. He held it out. Harry took it without comment. The paper was heavier than standard correspondence stock, marked only with a small security insignia in the corner. No names, no titles, just a series of numerical references printed in clean, precise type. Harry didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked back up at the guard. "What happened?" he asked. The guard held his gaze calmly. "Nothing," he said after a brief pause. That could not be explained. It was an unusual answer, not evasive, not vague, but carefully measured. Harry's brow shifted slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of the implication behind the wording. He broke the seal and unfolded the documents inside. Rows of timestamps, access clearance logs, security routing records, each entry precise to the minute. At first glance, they appeared routine. But as Harry's eyes moved down the page, the pattern revealed itself. Entire corridor zones listed as cleared, guest access temporarily suspended, security personnel repositioned well before the time indicated in the final line of the log. Harry's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, the guard was still watching him with the same composed neutrality. Harry's voice remained even. "These were authorized?" "Yes," the guard replied. "By whom?" The guard did not answer directly. Instead, he said quietly, "Nothing here occurs without instruction." The words hung between them, not accusatory, not explanatory, simply factual. Harry folded the documents carefully, slipping them back into the envelope with the same precision the guard had shown when handing them over. For a moment, neither moved. Then Harry exhaled slowly, not in anger, not in shock, but in recognition of what the silence of those records truly meant. Behind them, the corridor remained perfectly still, as though the entire building had already adjusted itself to contain whatever truth those pages now held. Harry did not climb the remaining steps immediately. He remained standing where he was, one hand resting lightly on the banister, the envelope still held in the other. The polished wood beneath his fingers felt cool and steady, an anchor against the quiet shift that had taken place inside him as he read the records. He opened the envelope again. This time he read more slowly. The first page listed standard access rotations, security patrol intervals, corridor sweeps, routine positioning. Nothing unusual. The kind of procedural detail that filled every day inside the estate. But the second page was different. There, the pattern changed. At precisely 1412, clearance was issued for the West Residential Wing, temporarily restricting all non-essential movement. At 1416, 2 service routes were rerouted. At 1421, guest access privileges were suspended for a specific interior corridor leading toward the private family quarters. Harry's eyes moved to the final entry, 1439, medical staff notified of minor incident. He didn't need further explanation. The order of events was unmistakable. The wing had been cleared before anyone acknowledged that something had happened. He read the timestamps again, not searching for error but confirming the inevitability of what they suggested. This had not been a reaction, it had been preparation. Harry closed the folder and held it against his side for a moment, his gaze drifting upward toward the landing beyond the guard. His voice when he spoke was quiet. "How many people would know this pattern exists?" "Very few," the guard replied. "Those who issue instructions, and those tasked with recording them." Harry nodded once. "And the photo?" he asked after a brief pause. The guard's expression did not change. "I sent it after the logs were finalized," he said, "before any explanations were written." It was not said defensively, nor apologetically. It was simply a statement of timing. Harry looked down at the envelope again, then back at the guard. "You didn't report this through normal channels," he said. "No," the guard replied calmly. "Why?" For the first time, the guard allowed the faintest shift in his tone. Not emotional, but weighted. "Because records show what happened," he said. "But they do not ensure the right person sees them in time." The words settled heavily in the quiet corridor. Harry absorbed them without reaction. There was no anger in his expression, no immediate conclusion drawn aloud, only a deeper stillness, like someone stepping into a space where the air felt subtly altered, and understanding that returning to the previous atmosphere was no longer possible. He folded the envelope once more, his movements precise. Then he looked toward the upper hallway that led to Lewis's room. "Is William inside?" he asked. The guard inclined his head. "Yes." Harry nodded. And without another word, he continued up the staircase, carrying not just the documents in his hand, but the quiet realization that whatever had happened here had been managed long before anyone outside those walls was meant to know. The corridor leading to Louis's room was dimly lit, the soft amber lamps along the walls casting long, quiet shadows across the polished floor. It was one of the older sections of the estate where sound carried differently, muted, as though absorbed by the thick stone and heavy tapestries that lined the passage. Harry's footsteps made almost no noise. Even so, the silence felt unusually complete. Doors that would normally remain slightly open during evening hours were closed. No staff moved through the hallway. No distant conversations filtered through the air. Everything felt contained. Yet he stopped outside the familiar door for a brief moment, his hand resting against the handle without immediately turning it. Not out of hesitation, but out of a quiet instinct to prepare for what waited beyond it. Then he opened it. The room inside was softly illuminated by a single bedside lamp. The curtains had been drawn partially, leaving only a narrow band of moonlight falling across the far wall. The atmosphere was calm, almost deceptively so. Prince William sat beside the bed, one hand resting loosely on the mattress near Louis's shoulder. He did not look up immediately when the door opened, his attention fixed on the slow, steady rise and fall of his son's breathing. Louis was asleep. The faint bruise on his cheek was visible even in the low light, softened by the shadows but unmistakable once seen. One arm was tucked beneath the covers, his posture relaxed now in a way that suggested the exhaustion of earlier discomfort had finally given way to rest. Harry stepped inside quietly, closing the door behind him with a controlled, gentle motion. William turned his head then. For a moment, neither brother spoke. There was no surprise in William's expression at seeing him, only a quiet acknowledgement, as though his presence had been expected without needing to be arranged. Harry moved closer, his gaze shifting briefly to Louis before settling on William. "How long?" he asked softly. William's eyes returned to his son. "Since late afternoon," he said. "Doctor says it's superficial. No serious injury." Harry nodded once. His hand rested lightly against the foot of the bed frame, his posture steady, composed. "The logs show the wing was cleared before anyone reported it," he said after a brief pause. William's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's what concerned me most." Harry glanced toward him. "Who authorized it?" William did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes moving to the far wall as though tracing the memory of events rather than the room itself. "I arrived after the fact," he said finally. "By the time I was informed, the corridor was already empty. Access had been restricted. Devices were being collected." His voice remained calm, but there was a heaviness beneath it, a measured restraint that carried more weight than any overt frustration could have. Harry absorbed the words without comment. For a moment, both brothers stood there in the quiet room, looking not at each other, but at the same small figure sleeping between them. And in that shared silence, the implication settled fully into place. Whatever had happened earlier that day, it had not been allowed to unfold naturally. It had been managed, contained. And that realization, more than the bruise itself, was what now lingered heavily in the still air of the room. The changes began without announcement. There were no raised voices in the corridors, no visible orders being issued, no sudden movements that might draw attention. From the outside, Balmoral remained exactly what it had always been: quiet, orderly, insulated from the noise of the world beyond its gates. But within its internal systems, something had already shifted. Harry noticed it first in the smallest details. A security officer stationed at the far end of the hallway stepped aside to allow a colleague to pass. Not an unusual gesture in itself, but the subtle exchange of a small digital device between them suggested something more precise was underway. Further down the corridor, a staff member quietly removed a guest access badge from a registry console and placed it into a sealed envelope. The motion was efficient, practiced, and entirely silent. Harry watched all of it without speaking. William remained beside him, his posture steady, but his gaze alert, following the same subtle movements with the awareness of someone who understood how the palace functioned beneath its composed exterior. "What have they changed?" Harry asked quietly. "Classifications," William replied. "Movement permissions, communication logs." His tone was even, but deliberate. "Standard containment protocol," he added. "When there's uncertainty about access integrity." Harry nodded once, absorbing the phrasing. It wasn't panic, it wasn't crisis, it was structure reasserting itself. In the distance, a pair of security personnel moved methodically through the adjacent corridor, their footsteps measured as they paused briefly at each doorway. They did not knock, they did not speak. Instead, they scanned access panels, verifying credentials with calm precision. The building itself seemed to adjust around them, like a system recalibrating to restore balance. Harry's gaze shifted toward the far staircase, where the guard had taken up a new position, not obstructing movement but anchoring it. His presence alone was enough to signal that the ordinary rhythm of the estate had been temporarily replaced by something more deliberate. No one approached him with questions, no one requested explanations. They simply moved around him, aware, respectful, and silent. "What happens now?" Harry asked after a moment. William's answer came without hesitation. "Now," he said, "we ensure it can't happen again." There was no anger in his voice, no overt demand for accountability, only a quiet certainty that whatever breach had occurred, whether intentional or careless, would be addressed within the same controlled system that had contained it. Harry watched as another staff member quietly removed a tablet from a workstation and sealed it inside a security case. No one spoke. No one needed to. The palace was doing what it had always been designed to do when something fell out of alignment. Not react loudly, but correct itself. And as the silent adjustments continued around them, it became clear that this correction would not come through confrontation or spectacle. It would come through procedure, through records, through quiet decisions made behind closed doors. The kind that left no visible trace, except the unmistakable sense that something had been decisively set back into place. It was well past midnight when the movement inside the estate finally slowed. The corridors had returned to their usual stillness, the quiet settling into the stone walls with the same familiar weight it carried every night. Lamps remained lit at measured intervals, casting steady pools of warm light that softened the edges of the long passageways. Harry and William stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the inner courtyard. Beyond the glass, the grounds stretched into darkness, interrupted only by the faint glow of security posts positioned at the estate's perimeter. Neither spoke for some time. There was nothing left to question about the sequence of events. Only the implications remained. William rested his hand lightly against the window frame, his gaze fixed on the faint outline of the central drive. "The clearance orders were issued early," he said at last, his voice low and controlled. "Too early to be reactive." Harry nodded. "That means someone anticipated the need to isolate the wing," he said quietly, "or wanted it isolated regardless." William didn't respond immediately. His expression remained calm, but the stillness in his posture suggested the weight of the realization had already settled firmly in place. "It wasn't a random access change," he said finally. "Those decisions require authorization at a level that isn't granted casually." Harry's eyes moved toward the corridor behind them, where the guard stood at a distance, maintaining his silent watch. "And whoever authorized it," Harry said, "would know the effect it would have." William nodded once, "Which is why it will be handled carefully." There was no mention of names, no spoken accusations. Inside the palace, responsibility was rarely addressed through public confrontation. It moved through channels, quiet reviews of clearance records, internal evaluations of decision chains, and procedural reassignment where necessary. Now, the process was designed to restore balance without destabilizing the institution itself. Harry exhaled slowly, his breath faint against the cool glass. "Lewis didn't understand what was happening," he said. "He only knew he was alone." William's gaze softened slightly at the words, though his voice remained steady. "That's the part that matters," he replied. "Not who authorized what, but ensuring it never places him in that position again." There was a pause, the kind that followed not uncertainty, but agreement. Behind them, a pair of senior staff members moved quietly down the corridor carrying sealed documentation cases, their footsteps soft against the floor. They did not approach the brothers, nor did they need to. Their presence alone confirmed what had already been set in motion. Reviews would be conducted. Clearances would be reassessed, and the system that had allowed the isolation to occur would be adjusted so that such a sequence could not be repeated. Harry turned slightly from the window, his eyes moving once more toward the guard standing at the far end of the hall. He understood now why the message had been sent the way it had, not through formal channels, not through official reports, but directly, because sometimes the difference between procedure and protection came down to ensuring the right people saw the truth before it was quietly absorbed into the machinery of routine. And tonight, that truth had already begun to move, silently, through the same channels that would ensure its consequences remained just as controlled. Dawn came slowly over Balmoral. The first light did not arrive with brightness, but with a gradual lifting of the darkness that had settled over the estate through the night. A thin gray glow spread across the hills, softening the sharp outlines of the trees and stone buildings until everything seemed to exist in a quiet in-between, neither fully night nor fully day. Inside, the palace corridors remained calm, returning to their usual rhythm as though nothing unusual had occurred. Staff moved with their familiar precision. Doors opened and closed softly. The scent of early morning tea drifted faintly through the air. Yet beneath that ordinary routine, there was a subtle shift, one that could only be noticed by those who knew exactly how the estate usually breathed. Harry stood beside the tall window at the end of the corridor, his hands resting loosely behind his back as he watched the central drive below. William stood a few steps away, his posture similarly composed, his gaze fixed in the same direction. Neither spoke. They did not need to. At precisely the same moment, a black vehicle appeared from the lower access road, its movement smooth and deliberate as it approached the inner gate. There were no flashing lights, no visible escort vehicles, only a single security car following at a measured distance behind it. The gate opened without hesitation. The vehicle did not stop. It passed through quietly, its tires barely disturbing the gravel as it moved toward the outer road that led away from the estate grounds. From this height, it was impossible to see who sat inside. And that, Harry understood, was intentional. The departure was not meant to draw attention. It was not meant to signal punishment. It was meant to restore order. To remove a presence that no longer belonged within the carefully controlled balance of the estate. Behind them, the corridor remained silent. The guard stood near the far wall, his posture unchanged, his presence steady and unobtrusive. He did not step forward, did not acknowledge the departure with any visible reaction. He simply remained at his post, exactly as he had been throughout the night. Harry watched the vehicle disappear beyond the outer gate, its dark shape blending into the pale morning mist until it was no longer visible. Only then did he exhale quietly, not in relief, not in satisfaction, but in recognition that whatever needed to be corrected had already been corrected, without confrontation, without spectacle, through the same quiet mechanisms that governed everything within those walls. Yet William's gaze lingered on the empty drive for a moment longer before he turned slightly, his voice calm when he spoke. "It's done," he said. Harry nodded once. And in the silence that followed, the estate settled fully back into its usual stillness, its balance restored not by noise or accusation, but by the quiet certainty that its boundaries had once again been reinforced. By mid-morning, Balmoral had resumed its familiar rhythm. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, warming the stone corridors and softening the edges of the heavy oak doors that lined the private wing. Staff moved about their duties with the same composed efficiency as always, their footsteps quiet, their conversations brief and professional. To an outside observer, nothing would have appeared unusual, but to those who had witnessed the night before, now the atmosphere carried a subtle clarity, as though an imbalance that had briefly unsettled the estate had been quietly corrected. Inside his room, Lewis sat cross-legged on the wide window seat where he had been photographed the day before. The bruise on his cheek had already begun to fade into a softer shade, no longer sharp against his skin. A book rested open in his lap. He turned its pages slowly, absorbed in the illustrations, his posture relaxed in the unguarded way of a child who had returned fully to a sense of normalcy. William stood nearby, speaking quietly with the attending physician, who offered a final reassurance before departing with a slight bow. "No further concern," the doctor said. "Just rest and normal activity." William nodded once. After the door closed, he remained where he was for a moment, yet watching his son without speaking. The steady quiet of the room carried no tension now, only the calm of routine restored. In the corridor outside, Harry found the guard standing near one of the tall archways overlooking the inner courtyard. He approached without announcement. The guard acknowledged him with a slight incline of his head, his posture unchanged. For a moment, Harry simply stood beside him, looking out at the grounds below where the morning light stretched across the lawns. Then he spoke quietly. "You didn't have to send the message," he said. The guard's gaze remained forward. "I didn't send it through official channels," he replied calmly, "because official channels record events after they are understood." Harry nodded slightly. "And you wanted it understood sooner," he said. "Yes." There was no pride in the guard's tone, no suggestion of personal judgment, only a simple acknowledgement of the role he had chosen to fulfill. Harry's eyes moved briefly toward the courtyard, where a few staff members crossed the gravel path in quiet conversation. "You could have remained within protocol," he said after a moment. "No one would have questioned it." The guard's reply came with the same steady calm. "My duty is to maintain the integrity of the environment," he said. "Sometimes that means ensuring the right people are aware, before records become routine." Harry absorbed the words without further comment. After a brief pause, he inclined his head slightly, not as a formal gesture, but as a quiet acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said. The guard did not respond verbally. He did not need to. His posture remained unchanged, his attention already returning to the quiet watch of the estate grounds below. And as Harry turned to walk back toward the private wing, the corridor behind him felt fully restored. Its stillness no longer carrying uncertainty, but the calm certainty that the balance within those walls had been quietly, decisively preserved. If you were in Harry's position, Would you have waited for an official explanation, or gone immediately after seeing that photo? And do you think the guard crossed a line by sending that message outside normal channels? Or was he the only one who truly did his duty that night? Tell us what you think in the comments. We read every response. If this story kept you watching, take a second to support the channel. Tap like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next moment when quiet protocol speaks louder than power. And if you know someone who appreciates stories about duty, tradition, and silent authority, share this video with them. 2 more stories are already on your screen now. Pick one, and we'll see you there.